My daughter stood up in a courtroom in Tulsa, Oklahoma, looked a judge in the eye, and said, "My father walked out on me when I was 4 years old and never looked back." 27 years of silence sat behind that sentence. Every person in that gallery turned to look at me like I was something they needed to scrape off their shoe. I didn't say a word. Not yet. Because sitting in a banker's box beside my attorney's chair were 412 pieces of proof that my daughter was wrong about the man who raised her, and she had no idea they existed. My name is Walter Reyes. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer for a firm that built bridges and overpasses across 3 states, and I live now in a modest brick ranch on East 71st Street in Tulsa, the kind of house you buy when you finally stop running numbers on load tolerances and just want a porch and a swing that doesn't creak too loud. I used to believe that if you did right by someone long enough, quietly enough, faithfully enough, the truth eventually finds its way home on its own. I was wrong about that. Sometimes the truth needs somebody to drive it there personally, with documentation, and I found that out in a courtroom on the 2nd floor of the Tulsa County Courthouse on a Thursday morning in March. What happened in that room is a moment I will remember for the rest of my life. Longer than I'll remember my own wedding day, longer than the day my granddaughter was born. But to understand why, you have to go back to the beginning, back before any of this, back to 1998, when I was a 38-year-old man standing in a driveway in Springfield, Missouri, watching a moving truck pull away with everything that mattered to me inside it. Let me back up. I married Diane Whitfield in 1992. I was 32, she was 29, and we met at a company picnic where she brought a potato salad that I still think about sometimes, which tells you something about how good things were in the beginning. We had Renee in 1994. I remember the exact weight, 7 pounds 2 ounces, and I remember standing in the hospital hallway at St. John's Medical Center calling my mother Collect because I didn't have a cell phone yet, and I was crying too hard to remember the area code for a second. Renee had my mother's dark eyes and Diane's stubborn chin, and for 4 years I thought I had built the one thing my own father never managed to build, which was a family that stayed. It didn't stay. Diane and I fought about money, about my hours, about 100 small things that were never really about the thing we said they were about. We divorced in the spring of 1998. Diane got primary custody, which in Missouri at that time was close to automatic, and she got permission to relocate for a job with an insurance company headquartered in Wichita, Kansas. I fought it. I hired a lawyer named Gordon Pruitt who told me flat out, in his office on Glenstone Avenue, that fathers in my position rarely won relocation battles, and that my best move was to accept a visitation and support schedule and stay consistent, because consistency was the only leverage a father like me was going to have. I want to be clear about something, because people ask me this constantly now. I did not want to let her go. I stood in that driveway on a Tuesday morning, June the 9th, and I watched a Ryder truck back down our street with my daughter's toy box strapped in the back, and something in my chest folded up like a lawn chair and never fully opened again. For the first 2 years, I did what the court ordered. Every other weekend, I drove 3.5 hours from Springfield to Wichita, checked into the same Best Western off Kellogg Avenue, and picked Renee up Saturday morning. She was 4, then 5, then 6. She liked pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse, and she was terrified of the automatic hand dryers in public restrooms. I know these things because I wrote them down. I kept a small notebook, spiral bound, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $1.19, and in it I logged every visit, every phone call, every gift I sent, because somewhere in the back of my mind I already knew I might need to prove one day that I had been there. Then, in the fall of 2001, Diane remarried. His name was Craig Voss, an actuary with a good job and a bigger house, and slowly, deliberately, the visits started getting harder to schedule. A cold that wouldn't clear up, a birthday party that conflicted, a family trip that got planned right over my weekend without warning. My friend Frank Delgado, who I'd known since we worked together on a highway overpass project outside Joplin back in the 80s, used to sit across from me at a diner on National Avenue and tell me the same thing every few months. Frank had retired from the Postal Service after 26 years, and he understood documentation the way some men understand fishing. "Walt," he'd say, stirring his coffee, "you cannot control what that woman does on her end. You can only control what you can prove on yours. Send everything certified. Every letter, every card, every check. Get a green receipt back with a signature on it. Because someday, Somebody's going to ask you to prove you were a father, and I want you to be able to hand them a shoebox instead of a memory." I laughed the first time he said it. I stopped laughing about 6 months later, in April of 2002, when Craig Voss filed a motion to modify custody, citing my inconsistent presence, and a judge in Sedgwick County, Kansas, reduced my visitation to supervised phone calls only, twice a month, 15 minutes each, monitored by Diane. I remember sitting in my truck in the courthouse parking lot after that hearing with my hands still on the wheel, engine off, for almost 40 minutes. I didn't cry then either. I want you to understand that about me, because it matters later. I don't do loud grief. I do quiet grief, the kind that just changes the shape of a man permanently and lets him keep walking around looking mostly normal. So I did the only thing left to do. I followed Frank's advice to the letter, and then I went further. Starting in May of 2002, I mailed Renee a letter every single month, certified, return receipt requested, to whatever address Diane had at the time. I mailed a birthday card every June the 14th without fail. I mailed a Christmas card every December. And every single month, on top of the court-ordered child support that came straight out of my paycheck automatically, I sent a separate personal check for $50, made out directly to Renee, with a note that said the same thing every time, in one form or another. "For your savings account, sweetheart. Love, Dad." I did that for 27 years. Even after she turned 18. Even after the phone calls stopped entirely in 2005, when Diane informed me through her attorney that Renee, then 11 years old, had said she no longer wished to speak with me. Even after I remarried in 2009 to a wonderful woman named Bonnie who never once asked me to stop. I never got a single letter back. Not one phone call. Not one photograph. For 27 years, I mailed proof of love into a silence so complete I started to wonder if the post office was simply losing every piece of it, some cruel logistical accident repeating itself for nearly 3 decades. It wasn't the post office, but I didn't know that yet. I saw Renee exactly 4 times as an adult. Once at Diane's mother's funeral in 2011, where she shook my hand like I was a distant cousin. Once in 2015, a chance encounter at a Cracker Barrel off I-44 outside Joplin, where she was 21 and cordial and gone in 11 minutes. Once at her own wedding in 2019, to a man named Trevor Bishop, where I sat in the 4th row, uninvited to the reception, and left before the cake was cut. And once, finally, in the spring of 2021, when she called me out of nowhere, voice tight and formal, to tell me she'd had a daughter. Lily, 6 pounds 9 ounces. She didn't invite me to the hospital. But over the following 2 years, something strange and fragile started happening. Diane, of all people, started arranging small visits. An hour here, a Sunday afternoon there, always supervised, always brief, always at Diane's insistence and never Renee's. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now, and it's the saddest part of this whole story, and I'll get to it. I didn't know it yet, but Diane was dying. She'd been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in November of 2022, and she told almost no one outside her own household until the following spring, when it was too late to hide. I need to stop here and give you the second thread of this story, because it matters just as much as the first one. Because while I was mailing letters into silence for 27 years, a woman named Yolanda Marsh was about to become the reason this story has a happy ending at all, and neither one of us knew it yet. Diane died on the 9th of August, 2023, in a hospice facility in Wichita called Harry Hines Memorial. In her final 6 weeks, she was cared for by a hospice aide named Yolanda Marsh, 49 years old, a woman who had been doing that work for 19 years and who told me later, when I finally met her, that she'd learned over those 19 years to pay very close attention to the things dying people say when they think nobody important is listening. Diane, in her final week, asked Yolanda to do something strange. She asked her to go to a self-storage facility on West Kellogg Drive, Unit 214, and retrieve a box. Just one box. She gave Yolanda the key from her own key ring and made her promise, made her swear on the life of her granddaughter, that whatever was in that box would eventually reach me. Not Renee. Me. Yolanda didn't understand why a dying woman would trust a hospice aide she'd known for 6 weeks with something that clearly mattered enough to swear an oath over. But she'd seen enough deathbeds to know that final requests are rarely random, and she made the promise, and she kept it. She retrieved the box 3 days after Diane's funeral. Inside, wrapped in a faded pillowcase, were 412 pieces of mail. Every letter, every birthday card, every Christmas card, every single one of my certified return receipts, the little green cards with Diane's own signature on them, dated across 27 years, proving she had signed for and received every piece I ever sent. And clipped together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age, 211 uncashed checks, each one made out to Renee for $50, totaling $10,550 that I had set aside for my daughter and that had simply sat in a storage unit collecting dust for over 2 decades. I didn't know any of this existed. Not yet. I want you to sit with that, because I sat with it for a long time once I found out. 27 years, and the woman I had married, the woman I had once believed I would grow old with, had been quietly intercepting every single attempt I made to stay present in my daughter's life. And then, somehow, in her final weeks on this earth, something in her cracked open enough to want it undone. I don't fully understand what changed in Diane at the end. Guilt does strange things to a dying person. I've made peace, mostly, with never getting a clean answer. But Yolanda didn't call me right away either, and that's its own part of this story. Because 3 weeks after Diane's funeral, before Yolanda had worked up the nerve to track me down, Renee filed a petition in Tulsa County District Court. I'd moved to Tulsa in 2010 after I remarried, and Renee and her husband Trevor had relocated there themselves in 2022. Close enough that occasional supervised visits with Lily had continued sporadically after Diane got sick, arranged always through Diane, who I now understand was trying, in her own damaged way, to build a bridge before she ran out of time to finish it. With Diane gone, Renee petitioned the court to formally terminate what she called my informal grandparent access to Lily, and to have it entered into a permanent record as a protective boundary. Her petition, filed by an attorney named Dana Ferris, stated that I had, in Renee's words, quote, abandoned the petitioner in early childhood and demonstrated a pattern of absence and non-engagement across her entire life, end quote, and that the family did not consider it safe or appropriate for an absent parent to establish a relationship with the next generation. I read that petition sitting at my own kitchen table with Bonnie standing behind my chair, her hand on my shoulder, and I felt something in me go very, very still. Not angry yet, just still, because I knew, with absolute certainty, that every word of it was false, and I had no earthly idea, at that point, how I was going to prove it. That's when Frank Delgado called me, like he had 100 times before over 30 years of friendship, and said the thing that changed everything. Walt, he said, you kept every one of those green cards, didn't you? Please tell me you kept them. I told him I had every certified mail receipt from 2002 through 2019, when the post office switched their tracking system, and I'd started keeping printed confirmation pages instead, right up through the final letter I mailed just 4 months earlier. In November of 2023, 3 months after Diane's funeral, a letter Renee never opened and never acknowledged, but that I still have the tracking confirmation for. Then Frank said something I'll never forget. He said, Walt, you've got proof of every letter you sent. What you don't have is proof of what happened to them once they landed. You need to find out who signed for them. I didn't know it yet, but that question was about to lead me straight to Yolanda Marsh, and to a storage unit on West Kellogg Drive that would blow this entire case wide open. I hired an attorney named Marisol Ibarra, out of a small firm on South Boston Avenue in downtown Tulsa, recommended to me by a man I'd worked with years before, whose own custody case she'd handled with a kind of quiet ferocity that I liked immediately. Marisol was 39, sharp as a tack, and the first thing she asked me, sitting across her desk on a rainy Tuesday in September, was whether I had documentation. I set the banker's box on her desk. 21 years of certified mail receipts, organized by year. In manila folders, I'd labeled myself on an old brother label maker. Marisol opened the first folder, looked at the top receipt, then looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as a lawyer trying very hard not to smile in front of a grieving client. Mr. Reyes, she said, do you know what a green card is worth in a case like this? I told her I hoped I was about to find out. She said, this isn't a case about whether you loved your daughter. This is a case about whether the court believes you tried. And these, she said, tapping the folder, are 21 years of proof that you tried every single month, on time, without fail. But she also told me something that worried me, sitting there in her office with rain streaking down the window behind her. "Green cards prove you sent something and someone signed for it," she said. "They don't prove what was inside the envelope." Renee's attorney will argue, "You could have been mailing empty pages. We need something stronger. We need the letters themselves." That's when I remembered the checks. 200 and some odd checks, every one for $50, made out to Renee, that I'd been writing since 2002 and that had simply never come back to me cashed. I'd assumed for years, in some quiet corner of my mind I never fully examined, that Renee had simply never bothered depositing them. One more small rejection among many, and I'd stopped even checking after a while because it hurt too much to keep looking. Marisol's eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen from anyone in a very long time. "Uncashed checks with a memo line," she said, "are not proof of an empty gesture, Mr. Reyes. They're proof of continuous, deliberate financial provision across 2 decades. If we can locate even a handful of the actual letters, the physical letters themselves, this case doesn't just get easier. It gets over." We didn't know where to find them. Renee certainly didn't have them. She'd told the court, under oath in a deposition 2 weeks later, that she had never received so much as a birthday card from me in her entire adult life, and I believe, to this day, that she believed that when she said it. That's the part of this story that still keeps me up some nights. I didn't know it yet, but the answer to where 27 years of letters had gone was sitting in a hospice worker's guest bedroom in Wichita, still wrapped in that faded pillowcase, waiting for a woman named Yolanda Marsh to finally work up the courage to make a phone call she'd been putting off for 6 weeks. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. If this is your first time here, grab something warm to drink, get comfortable, because this story only gets heavier before it gets lighter. If you've been with us a while, you already know what I'm going to ask. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and stay with me, because what happened next in that courthouse is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Yolanda Marsh called Marisol's office on a Thursday afternoon in late October, not knowing anything about the lawsuit, not knowing anything about me except the name Diane had whispered from a hospice bed. She'd found Marisol's number the way most people find anything these days, by searching for family attorneys in Tulsa County and calling the first 3 that came up, hoping one of them might know how to reach a man named Walter Reyes. Marisol's paralegal, a sharp young woman named Priya Anand, took the call, heard the words hospice and box of letters and Diane Voss, and put Yolanda on hold so fast she nearly disconnected the line. I met Yolanda Marsh in person 8 days later, in Marisol's conference room, and I want to tell you what that moment looked like, because it's one of the 2 or 3 moments in this entire ordeal that I will carry with me until the day I die. She set a cardboard banker's box on the conference table, the same kind of box I'd carried into that office myself 2 months earlier, and she said, "Mr. Reyes, I don't know you, and I didn't know your ex-wife more than 6 weeks before she passed. But she made me promise, and I don't break promises to dying women." I opened that box with hands that were not entirely steady, and on top, still wrapped in its pillowcase, was every letter I had written to my daughter since the summer of 2002. Some of the envelopes were yellowed. Some still had the certified mail stickers half peeled at the corners, and clipped beneath them, held together with a rubber band gone brittle and cracked, were 211 checks, uncashed, every single one made out to Renee Reyes, later Renee Bishop, for $50 each. I sat in that conference room, and I opened the first letter I could reach, dated March the 14th, 2004, and read my own handwriting describing a trip I'd taken to Table Rock Lake, hoping someday to take Renee there myself, hoping she was doing well in the 2nd grade, hoping. I read 12 more before Marisol gently took the folder out of my hands and told me I needed to save my strength for the hearing. I didn't know it yet, but Renee's attorney was about to make a critical mistake in that courtroom, one born of absolute confidence that no such box could possibly exist, and that mistake was going to hand us the entire case. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March of 2024, 7 months after Diane's death, in a courtroom on the 2nd floor of the Tulsa County Courthouse, Judge Eleanor Castellano presiding. I want to describe that room to you because I remember every detail of it with a clarity that still surprises me. Wood paneling gone slightly gray with age. A clock on the back wall that ran 2 minutes fast. Renee sat at the petitioner's table beside her attorney, Dana Ferris, wearing a gray blazer I didn't recognize, her hair pulled back the way her mother used to wear hers for important meetings. Trevor sat behind her in the gallery, and beside him, in a stroller, was Lily, not yet 2 years old, wearing a small yellow cardigan, entirely unaware that she was the reason this room was full. Renee's testimony came first. She spoke clearly, without notes, the way a person speaks when they've told themselves a story so many times it has become load-bearing architecture in their own mind. She described a childhood she believed to be true. Birthdays with no cards. Christmases with no calls. A father, she said, who chose a new wife and a new life over the daughter he already had, and who reappeared only decades later, when it was convenient, when there was a grandchild worth showing up for. I sat at the respondents' table and I watched my daughter say these things about me with absolute conviction, and I understood, maybe for the first time all the way down to the bottom of it, that Renee wasn't lying. She genuinely believed every word. That was almost harder to sit through than if she'd known she was lying. Judge Castellano asked Renee directly, "Did your father ever attempt to contact you, to your knowledge, across your childhood or adult life?" And Renee said, without hesitation, "No, Your Honor. Not once that I'm aware of. Not a single letter. Not a single call that wasn't required by a court order and monitored by my mother." That's when Marisol stood up. "I want you to understand something about my attorney. Marisol Ibarra does not raise her voice in a courtroom. She told me once that volume is what people reach for when they don't have evidence, and she has never once needed to reach for it." She stood, calm as still water, and she said, "Your Honor, the respondent would like to enter into evidence a box of 211 personal checks, written by Mr. Reyes to his daughter continuously from 2002 through 2019, along with 412 items of correspondence, letters and cards, sent to the petitioner across the same period, and 231 certified mail return receipts bearing the petitioner's mother's own signature, confirming delivery of that correspondence to the addresses where the petitioner resided as a minor." The courtroom went very quiet. I watched Dana Ferris's face change in real time, the particular kind of stillness that comes over a lawyer who has just realized the ground under her feet is not where she thought it was. Renee turned in her chair and looked at me for the first time all morning, and I want to tell you, the look on her face wasn't anger yet. It was confusion. Pure, bottomless confusion. The look of a person watching the floor of their own memory quietly rearrange itself. Marisol had the box brought forward, and one by one, she began reading. She read the memo line from a check dated June 1998. "For your savings account, sweetheart." She read another, from December 2003. "Merry Christmas, my girl. I think of you every single day." She read from a letter dated my daughter's 10th birthday, describing a bicycle I had wanted to buy her and hadn't been permitted to deliver, describing how I hoped she was doing well in the 4th grade, how I hoped her mother was taking good care of her, how much I loved her, how I would keep writing every month for as long as it took. She read the return receipts, one after another, each one bearing a signature. D. Voss, D. Voss, D. Voss. 231 times, across 17 years, my daughter's mother had personally signed for proof that I had never once stopped reaching for my child. I watched Renee's hands begin to shake somewhere around the 9th or 10th item Marisol read into the record. Dana Ferris asked for a recess. Judge Castellano granted 15 minutes, and I watched my daughter walk out of that courtroom with her husband's hand on her back, and I did not follow her. I stayed in my seat, and Bonnie, who had come to sit behind me every single day of this process, put her hand on the back of my neck the way she does, and I finally, for the first time in that entire ordeal, let myself cry. Not loudly, just quietly, the way I do everything, tears running down into the collar of a shirt I'd bought new for that exact morning, because I wanted to look like a man who deserved to be believed. When the court reconvened, Renee's demeanor had changed entirely. Dana Ferris requested to withdraw the petition. Judge Castellano did not immediately grant it. Instead, she looked at Renee directly and asked her a question I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, "Ms. Bishop, I have practiced family law for 26 years, and I have seen a great many cases where the truth is complicated and both sides carry a piece of it. This does not appear to be one of those cases. I would like to hear, on the record, whether you still believe the statement you made to this court this morning." Renee stood up. Her voice had lost every trace of the certainty it carried an hour earlier. She said, "Your Honor, I need to speak with my father. I didn't know any of this existed. My whole life, I need a minute. Judge Castellano granted the recess. And this time, when Renee walked out of that courtroom, she stopped in front of my table first, and she looked at me. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. And then she said 4 words that undid 27 years in about a second and a half. Did you really write those? I told her yes. Every single one. I want to pause the courtroom for a moment, because there's a piece of this story I promised you at the beginning, a promise about warmth, and this is where it belongs. Frank Delgado did not live to see that hearing. Frank passed away in February of 2023, 11 months before that day in court, from a heart condition he'd managed quietly for years without much complaint, the same way he did most things. But 3 weeks before he died, sitting in my kitchen over coffee, he told me something I've held on to ever since. He said, "Walt, you're not doing this for a courtroom. You never were. You're doing it because 27 years from now, when that girl finally reads what you wrote, she's going to know exactly who her father was the entire time, whether a judge ever sees a single page of it or not." I framed a photograph of Frank in his mail carrier uniform, the one from 1979, standing in front of his old delivery truck, and it hangs in my study today. And every year on the anniversary of his passing, I drive out to the cemetery on Highway 60 outside Joplin, and I tell him how the story ended. I think he'd have liked knowing that his advice, given over diner coffee for 20 years, was the entire reason his best friend's granddaughter grew up knowing her grandfather instead of a story about him. And Yolanda Marsh, the hospice aide who kept a promise to a dying woman she'd known for 6 weeks, refused every offer I made to pay her for what she'd done, for the gas money, for the time, for the simple decency of it. I finally convinced her, months later, to accept a modest gift, a certificate for continuing education courses in palliative care, along with a letter, handwritten, the same kind I'd written to Renee for 27 years, thanking her for finishing a job I couldn't finish myself. She wrote back exactly once. She said, "Mr. Reyes, I've done this work 19 years, and I've carried a lot of dying people's last wishes to a lot of strangers' doorsteps. Yours is the only one that ever turned out to have a happy ending on the other side of it." That letter sits in a frame in my study too, right beside Frank's photograph, because I believe some debts should be visible, not just felt. Back in that courtroom, Judge Castellano ultimately did not simply grant a withdrawal of the petition. At Renee's own request, through her attorney, the court instead entered a consent order establishing formal, unrestricted grandparent visitation rights for me with Lily, along with language in the record, at Renee's insistence, correcting the earlier characterization of my history with her. Judge Castellano, before adjourning, made one more comment I've never forgotten. She said that in 26 years on the family court bench, she had seen a great many cases where a parent claimed abandonment as a shield, and rarely, if ever, had she seen a case where the truth arrived stacked in a banker's box with 231 signatures on it. She said the record would reflect that Walter Reyes had, in her words, demonstrated a level of persistent, documented paternal devotion that the court found, quote, "genuinely remarkable," end quote. I don't need a judge's praise to know what kind of father I tried to be, but I won't pretend it didn't matter to hear it, after 27 years of silence, in a room full of strangers. Renee and I did not repair everything in a single afternoon. I want to be honest with you about that, because these stories sometimes get told like a door swings open and everything on the other side is instantly whole again, and that has not been my experience of real life, not once. What happened instead, over the following months, was slower, and in some ways more valuable. Renee asked to see the letters, all 412 of them, and I brought them to her house on a Saturday afternoon in April, and we sat at her kitchen table on Riverside Drive for 6 hours while she read them one at a time, out loud sometimes, quietly other times, and cried in a way I think she'd needed to cry for a very long time, and simply never had cause to before. She asked me questions I'd waited half my life to answer. Why didn't you fight harder in the beginning? Why didn't you show up at my school even once, uninvited, and just stand outside the fence? I told her the truth, that Gordon Pruitt had warned me a man who violates custody boundaries, however well-intentioned, only hands ammunition to the other side, and that I'd chosen, every single time, the slow road of documentation over the fast road of a scene that might have gotten me arrested and permanently barred. I told her I regretted that choice some nights and believed it was the right one on others, and that both of those things were true at once and always would be. She asked about the 211 uncashed checks, $10,550 that had simply sat in a storage unit accumulating dust instead of interest. I told her I didn't want the money back. I told her I wanted her to open an account for Lily and put every dollar of it in, untouched, and let it be the first thing her daughter ever owned that came directly from a grandfather she was, by then, finally getting the chance to know. Renee did exactly that. The account sits at a credit union on South Yale Avenue, and every June the 14th, on what would have been my own private anniversary of the first letter I ever sent, I add another $50 to it, the same amount, the same handwriting on the memo line. For your savings account, sweetheart. Except now the sweetheart is 2 years old and has no idea yet what any of it means, and someday, I hope, somebody will sit her down at a kitchen table the way Renee sat across from me, and tell her the whole story, start to finish, so she grows up understanding exactly what devotion looks like when it has to survive 27 years of silence to prove itself. I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about Diane, and I want to say something about her before I close this out, because I don't think this story is honest if I only tell you the parts that make her a villain. I don't fully know why she did what she did, and I've made a kind of peace with never knowing completely. I believe some of it was grief over our marriage ending, curdled slowly over years into something uglier than grief usually stays. I believe some of it was Craig Voss, who I later learned had pushed hard, from the very beginning of their marriage, for a clean break, a fresh start, a family that looked forward instead of backward. And I believe, in the end, something in Diane couldn't carry the weight of it anymore, not as death got close, not with a granddaughter in the world who deserved better than the story her mother had been telling. I don't forgive easily, and I won't pretend the anger is entirely gone. But I try to hold on to the fact that in her very last weeks on this earth, Diane made one true and difficult choice, and it was the choice that gave my daughter her father back. That has to count for something. I choose to let it count for something. Renee and I have Sunday dinner now, most weeks, at my house on East 71st Street, the same table where Bonnie makes a pot roast that Lily is still too young to properly eat but insists on reaching for anyway. Trevor comes when his schedule allows. Lily calls me Papa Walt, a name Renee chose herself, and every time I hear it I think about a man standing in a driveway in Springfield, Missouri, in 1998, watching a moving truck disappear down the street, believing he had lost everything, and having no possible way of knowing that 27 years of Tuesday afternoons at a post office counter would someday be the exact thing that brought it all the way back. I want to leave you with something my father used to tell me, long before any of this happened, back when I was a young man just starting out in an engineering firm, learning that every structure worth building has to be able to bear weight it can't always see coming. He said, "Walter, you don't build a bridge to be believed in today. You build it to still be standing the day somebody finally needs to cross it." I didn't understand what he meant for most of my life. I understand it now. I built something for 27 years that nobody could see, that nobody acknowledged, that by every outward measure looked like it was going nowhere at all. And when the day finally came that my daughter needed it, it was still standing, every letter, every check, every green card with a signature on it, strong enough to carry the weight of an entire courtroom's disbelief and come out the other side intact. If you're a father out there right now, still writing letters nobody answers, still sending checks nobody cashes, still showing up to a silence that never seems to break, I want you to hear this clearly. Keep the receipts. Not because you'll need them in a courtroom, though you might. Keep them because somewhere down the road, whether it's a judge or a daughter or a granddaughter not yet born, somebody is eventually going to need proof of exactly who you were the whole time nobody was watching. And when that day comes, I promise you, it will be worth every single stamp. If this story meant something to you tonight, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let me know. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.